This is Bill Pepper. He had to go on, but we will bring Peter Del Scott on to read the rest of his talk and take questions and answers later. We'll get Doug Valentine up. We might get Russ Baker as an additional speaker, so we'll cram him in as best we can. We might take a little more of your dinner time away from you, but I think you can stand it. So our next speaker, as scheduled, is coming in by remote. His name is Dr. G. Paul Chambers, PhD. And he's written a recent book called Headshot, The Science Behind the JFK Assassination. And G. Paul Chambers lives in La Plata, Maryland. He's a contractor with NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Goddard Optics Branch, and with Bellatrix Incorporated. Formerly, he worked as a supervisory research physicist for the Energetic Materials and Detonation Science Department of the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Maryland, and as a research physicist with the Condensed Matter and Radiation Sciences Division of the National Naval Research Laboratory in D.C. And he's the author of Headshot, a Prometheus books that just came out. How are we? We have image yet?
Now he's starting up again. He's starting up again?
So he can go. He just needs to tell us when he wants the slideshow.
I'm still not seeing you on our...
Wait, you want to get okay.
Goes on here?
Oh, okay.
Sound?
It's not a long book, it's not 1,000 pages, but the inspiration for the headshot is this book, which is 1,000 pages, and I need to work out to lift it. What I'd like to do, if I could, is to go to the slideshow. I'm a very lazy guy, and I don't want to read thousands of pages, so what I want to do is look and see if somebody's science is correct. If the science is accurate, because that's my background, then I have a good feeling for what's going on. So if we could go to the slideshow right now, I'd really appreciate it if that's set up. And if we could go to the first slide, just as an introduction. The second slide is called Bad Science That You Would See in Reclaiming History. And some of the things I found in there on page 488 were that small objects cannot push large objects because they're too small, which would be of interest to the dinosaurs who were wiped out by a small asteroid 6 miles in diameter, which is tiny compared to the Earth, which is 6,000 miles in diameter, so it's 1 billion times larger. Yet it destroyed the biosphere. Why? Because it was moving very, very fast. The other thing I found in Buglos's book was that soft tissue can redirect the path of a bullet through high-angle deflections.
What's that?
We lost him.
Yeah, but he's offline.
Oh, he's
Yeah,
offline.
he dropped- He dropped back offline.
I think it must be.
How about bad technology?
Well, it might be on his. It sounds. I mean, it seems like it's on his.
Here he comes again.
He's coming back.
Yeah, it keeps dropping off of the Ustream. I don't know why.
Yeah, we lost.
Taking physics in high school,
Okay,
so
there we
that explains why things
Well,
Are you lost the feed?
We're back.
We're back.
last line there.
You got it back?
Yeah.
He was talking about soft tissue.
Yeah, soft.
We're back, okay. I don't know why we keep losing it. Are my slides up? All right, I don't know if my slides are up or not, but
Yes.
Visibility says that avoided taking physics in high school, and this explained everything. Well, Tom Hanks is thinking is going to do a special on this book, a mini-series, and I think it's going to be rough for Mr. Hanks, who's done some great work like Apollo 13, and to do something like this, which is just very bad science, would be a disaster. But not to worry, I sent Mr. Hanks a copy of my book. So if we could go to the next slide, which would be Good Science, which talks about Feynman's physics and what you would learn if you read Richard Feynman's lectures on physics. Professor Feynman gave a series of lectures in '62 and '63 during the time of Kennedy's assassination, Kennedy's presidency. And this was made into a series of volumes that are considered by many. Carl Sagan thought it was the best book ever written of science for the layman. What you would find in there is momentum is conserved. In other words, if I have a small object that's moving very, very fast, and it's a large object, that object has to absorb that recoil momentum from a small object. So a small object can put a larger object into motion. Momentum is conserved if there's not an outside force acting, so momentum, the magnitude of momentum is always mass times velocity, and small mass velocity equals big mass velocity with the velocity adjusting proportionally. The second thing you'll learn is momentum is a vector, which means it has both a magnitude, 100 miles per hour, kilograms, and a direction. So the direction also has to be conserved. You can see that if you have balls on your pool table. And lastly,
He died on his end again.
Just stay on the phone. Tell him to keep the phone open. Not like we're seeing.
Since we're looking at a slideshow, we might just keep moving on. You can't pull it off because this is connected. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, we lost the feed again.
Momentum is a vector, which means there's a magnitude and a direction. So it might be 60 miles an hour times kilograms, which would be a momentum. But it will also have a direction. Direction is moving along the highway. If a car collides with another momentum vector like a truck, something is going to happen in the adverse direction. Next, the swing actually supports the weight of the child. The tension in the ropes of the swing supports the child against gravity. So it's very easy to push the child. I'm just pushing against F equals ma, which is the standard Newton's law. Lastly, energy is also conserved. So in this formula, the kinetic energy given by 1 mv squared is equal to the potential energy given by mgh. So this one form of energy there are many forms of energy. So lastly,
just one form of energy, there are many other forms of energy that some computer. Lastly,
He's back live now.
so if that was true 50 years ago, it's very true today because the whole world is based on computer technology and fiber optics and GPS devices and laser interferometry and so forth. So this is a crucial field that's important for everybody to know. If we look at the Warren Commission, jumping back again back to the 60s, they said two things. One is that they weren't all sure that the single bullet theory was viable, and it turned out that because of this Zapruder film, if the frames don't match up such that Kennedy and Connor would have to be shot by two separate bullets, too closely together in time for that particular gun to fire the bullets. So therefore they came up with a single bullet theory, which allows one bullet to do both twins, and that gets them out of the dilemma. But in the next sentence they say on the basis of the...
Oh, right, you did it.
It's equivalent to publishing the Epimenides paradox as a conclusion. The statement below is true, the statement
Up
above is
again,
false.
so over there on
The government
right
usually doesn't
side, up
lie
above.
in misinformed. And one of the ways you can spot this information is these kind of contradictory statements is what you see in the Warren Commission.
It was none of those, Carl, it was above.
If we go to the next slide, please. Why did the commission fail when it had to dwell on a purpose and where JFK? Junior investigators trying to get the truth, but the people in the commission joined the commission to protect America's
The commission joined the commission to protect America's reputation and overall the goals in mind. So if those goals don't match up, one becomes dominant. The other issue is they didn't have any diversity of background. Everyone on the commission, all the junior investigators were all lawyers, so they operated under a single paradigm, which was the body is prima facie evidence, and physics and science don't matter because the truth is what you can prove to a jury. I'll put on another expert to contradict the first expert, etc. And the other problem they had was they based their model on corrupted data, which we'll talk about in a second. And the next more serious problem is they altered the data. Gerald Ford actually altered the autopsy data from an entrance wound in the back to a wound in the back of the neck to make the single bullet theory work. And there are two ways guaranteed to get the wrong answer. One is alter your data, two is build your model on corrupted data. They did both. How does science get at the truth? How do I look at a subject scientifically? And the first one I talk about is Piltdown Man in the book because it's a major hoax of the 20th century where people that in 1909 cobbled together some fossils in an aquarium, pretended it was an ancient fossil and it looked very primitive, and it fooled the anthropological community for about 40 years. And it wasn't ultimately uncovered until people began to apply new techniques to old data. That is, they used radiocarbon data to show that these fossils weren't of great antiquity. But even before that, people suspected it because they weren't consistent with other data and other fossils that were being discovered. So the solution here is what you do is you fit models to data, not data to models. You don't have a preconceived notion, force your data into it. Instead, you let the data speak for itself and tell you where to go. And the classic use of that was Kepler, who modeled the elliptical orbits of the planets. He had Tycho Brahe's data, which was the greatest data, naked eye measurements ever assembled. But he couldn't match it up to circular orbits as the Greeks had told him would work. So what he did was he finally was able to get out of the paradigm.
Now he goes on to use that and plug it into his calculus, which he discovers when he's sitting home in 1665. And once he does that, he's able to discover the universal law of gravitation. So Newton not only discovered the law of gravitation, but he proved it mathematically and scientifically. This is a major turning point in the history of science. What allowed Kepler to
Which way?
notion of circular orbit was that a supernova had appeared in the skies of 1604. And that led him to understand that the Greeks were wrong, that the universe wasn't immutable. And with that knowledge, he was able to get the right answer. The supernovas
The supernovas pose special problems in science because they don't fit into a classic model of a reproducible experiment or physical evidence. You can't reproduce them, you're not in control of them, they don't leave any evidence behind, they flash for a couple weeks and that's it. So the way you study them is to use multiple independent instrumented methods. So I would have a telescope and I'll say there's a supernova, galaxy M31, and you might say, well no, there's a firefly on the lens. And every time you take a picture, it's flashing. Okay, so I call up the Keck and Hawaii, I said there's a supernova at M31, they see the same thing. Now if I say there's a firefly on their lens, or their mirror, that firefly would have to be in the exact same place on both mirrors, and the odds of that happening are astronomically small. So the bottom line is if two multiple instruments are applied to the same transient event, they're not likely to glitch up in exactly the same way. So that gives you enormous confidence in the result. And this is the program we need to find what happened to Kennedy. If I go to the next slide, please. Next slide shows medical alterations. The Cyberneer reporter talks about surgery of the head. David Lifton has a really good book, Best Evidence, that talks about how these were manipulated. You can see the throat wounds been enlarged, possibly by someone looking for a bullet. And on the right side, you can see a photograph of his head from this rear film. It doesn't match at all up to the official autopsy photo, which is showing extensive damage to the top of his head. Once data is corrupted, once a medical expert says surgery of the head, and there was no surgery performed in Dallas, you know the data is corrupted, and you have to jump through backwards to salvage that. So don't build models on corrupted data, and that's why the Warren Commission got the wrong answer. The next slide shows where the bullet enters, a ruler pointing.
Autopsy report to the right, the shirt wounds and witnesses all put the bullet wound in his neck. It's not in his neck, as was said. The other issue is the x-rays. The x-rays don't look like they're his head because the front part of the skull is blown out. That's not consistent with any descriptions or doctor's report of Warren Commission. But in here you can see fragments of a bullet, say, in the front part of the head. Next slide, please. Wow. Okay. Sorry. The next slide is the single bullet theory, and that's showing what would be required for a bullet hitting in the back at a downward angle. We know also that it's the lung because that's reported on the official autopsy. So a bullet coming in the back at a downward angle and hitting the lung must continue out through the chest. It can't go anywhere else. That's exactly what it does to Connolly. It's in the back, punches out through his chest. This is what would happen to Kennedy. Unless the soft tissue of the lung could redirect it, then it could come up through his trachea. But if it does that, it clips his jaw and keeps on going. So even that's not good enough. What has to happen is the soft tissue of the lung has to redirect it back up to another angle of deflection and another angle of deflection back down to Connolly at the right angle. And this is not what's in the robot. So it's like shooting a bullet into somebody and having it bounce back out again. You never see it happen. So unless Kennedy's bones were made of depleted uranium or he was the bionic man, this scenario is impossible. And if we look at the next slide, what you're looking at is the timing of the shots. And you can test human reaction times with a simple test where you have a friend drop a ruler and you catch it, pinch it between your fingers. The normal drop's about 8 inches, which corresponds to about a couple hundred milliseconds. And if you look at the two men when they emerge from the sun, Kennedy is not reacting, but you can see his lapel flopping up. Some people say that's when the shot hits him. Maybe it does. He doesn't react till 2:36, which is about 10 frames later. You have to argue a delayed reaction. But even if I give you that, Kennedy's well into his reaction. He's now reaching for his throat. So the bullet must have hit him 200 milliseconds earlier. Now the Corcana round goes 2,000 feet per second.
And 200 milliseconds is 400 feet downrange. The distance between Kennedy and Connolly is about 3 feet. So the bullet hit Kennedy is way downrange by the time that propel flops out. So the bottom line is the timing events completely makes this impossible. And the single bullet theory is another example of a marvelous theory shot down by a brutal gang of facts. Now, what did...
Now, if you look at the data set on the top left, it shows what breaking this bouncing up and down. This is consistent with shock data, any kind of shock wave or pressure transducer measurement into a bomb proof will show this kind of ringing effect. But the salient thing is on the right, you can get a very good matchup between the subverter film and the acoustic data. The frames match up very, very accurately to where the collie thinks he shot, to where the car emerges behind the tree and so forth, and to a girl running alongside. You have a very good matchup. And that kind of matchup doesn't happen accidentally. It only happens when all the measurements are done correctly. Even so, the house got the wrong answer again. They thought the bullet came from behind and through the top of his skull. Cyril Wecht and members of the committee told them that a frangible round coming from the front would give them the exact result that they see in the metadata, which was extensive fragmentation on the right side of the brain and no fragmentation on the left. Unfortunately, they ignored that. I just want to quickly look at the possibility for a headshot from behind. You can see Kennedy's orientation is facing forward, so if the bullet comes in straight from behind, what's required is it makes an L-shaped turn and comes out the side of his head. And supposedly jetting causes the head to recoil backwards. That could only happen if the bullet came from the other side of the Dealey Plaza. That scenario wouldn't have any meaning. But we know that doesn't work because the Discovery Channel did the same test from behind, pinged the top of his head off, but couldn't reproduce the recoil of the head. So that didn't make any sense. The bottom line, this theory requires a bullet to make an L-shaped turn, somebody said. If you say the official X-ray is real, two minutes got fragments.
If you say the official X-ray is real, 2 minutes got fragments, so I can't fake this experimentally. If your theory is so bad I can't fake it experimentally, then it's beyond ridiculous. I could put a metal plate in his head, redirect the bullet, but I couldn't get fragments to the top. So this is just an absurd theory. The next slide, please. This is a ballistic pendulum. What happens in the ballistic pendulum is like a childless flame. The bullet will impact a block of wood, stick inside the wood, and the wood now is on a string or rod will have to absorb that recoil momentum, and it'll kick up. And the height that it kicks up gives that little energy formula I showed you before. The height gives you equals the kinetic energy of the block when it got kicked off. That backs you out the velocity, and from that you can back out the velocity of the initial bullet. And this is a typical device used to measure velocity of bullets. The key is the bullet sticks inside the wood and doesn't penetrate. If it penetrates, it carries its own recoil momentum. If it sticks inside the wood, it's got to absorb that recoil momentum and go up.
John.
With a high-speed round coming in, the fluid in the head, the blood is incompressible fluid, so when you put it under pressure, it's going to come squirting back out again, which is what happens. And then Kennedy's head recoils, just like the ballistic pendulum, because the blood's stuck in his head. In other words, there's no exit wounds on the other side. His head was forced to absorb that recoil momentum, and it kicks him backwards. And you also see he's going back at about a 45-degree angle, so he's going back and towards Jackie. And the fact that he's going back immediately after the strike in 313 rules out the possibility of a muscle spasm because he's reacting within 50 milliseconds. That's too fast. Again, humans can't react that fast to a shock or an insult. So that rules out that theory. So the only right theory is that a bullet impacting from the right front side, as Cyril Wecht says, caused extensive damage to the right side of his brain and none to the left side. If I can have the next slide, please.
And none to the left side. If I can have the next slide, please. The next slide identifies the weapon that would produce this. Turns out there's a hunting rifle that was produced in 1935. And
Swift that uses a .223 round. It propels a 50-grain bullet at speed.
It's used for small game, but it's very, very fast. It can propel 220 Swift that uses a .223 round. It propels a 50-grain bullet at speeds exceeding 4,000 feet per second. And this is characteristic, all the jetting you see is characteristic of a high-speed round, extensive damage to its head, decapitations, all characteristic of a very high-velocity round coming in. And I worked out the momentum, and I got something like 3.7 kilograms per meter per second for the incoming round. And the momentum of the head recoil is about 3.53 kilograms per meter per second. It's a very good agreement between the head recoil and the round coming in. It's also got some momentum left over to kick fragments and so forth. The .220 Swift is still the fastest commercial cartridge you can buy today. This is the fastest gun you can buy. And if you only got one shot and you're constrained to use a small caliber, because a large caliber would just do too much damage, this is the best gun you could possibly use. If we go to the next slide, please. Momentum is a vector, which means I've got to not only conserve the magnitude but the direction. So if I kick my bullet back at a 40 feet 5 degree angle, it gets you to a point at the behind the picket fence on the west of Grassy Knoll. And that is the exact same place that the house identified the bullet coming from based on the acoustic evidence. They fired live fire tests into the plazas, and they got the best possible match, and they got one shot coming from this.
Exactly the same thing. Probability of them both glitching up the same way is astronomically low. And we'll just go to the next one here. If we can go to the next slide, please. Some people feel this Zapruder film's altered. There's a lot of controversy. David Ronan has a nice book called The Zapruder Film that says it would be very difficult for someone to steal in the middle of the night, fly back to Washington, alter it. By next morning, time gets control of it next morning. They wouldn't alter the film. Wreck the revenue stream. Every other photograph and the assassination shows this head snap backwards. So, and then the last question, if you say the government altered the film, why would they do this to show a shot coming from the front? That doesn't make any sense. And lastly, the film camera expert from Kodak, Roland Zavada, is looked at it with the eye to alteration in camera. And that's a pretty powerful testimony. Zavada talked last week at JFK Lancer, and I think he made a very, very powerful and persuasive presentation of what we would be required to do. There's kind of alterations in a way that you couldn't detect them, and it's virtually impossible. I would say if you want to make this theory fly, fake a film up and fool Roland Zavada. If you can make the
and fool Roland Zavada. If you can make the alterations in a film of Kodachrome 2 and you can fool him, then you have a viable forgery. And a viable forgery would be very valuable because you can do all sorts of microstructural characterizations on that, like X-ray diffraction or XPS, etc. And you can prove it microstructurally. But short of that, I think it's going to be a tough go. Well, these are finally, if I go to the last slide, it just talks about from visibiliosi to the historical record, knowing nothing of the president can exist without paternity of history, and hence the latter is sacred, should never be tampered with or defiled by untruths. I believe that's a true statement. Unfortunately, Mr. Bugliosi has the wrong answer, but his statement holds true. For Shantiana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Lastly, my favorite, he who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. And this is a scary statement, but if you let the government tell you disinformation and accept that, then you're living in the world of 1984. Headshot shows you there are simple experiments anybody can do. You can go down your basement and test momentum conservation. You can use Newton's cradle, which is a little pendulum that balls that bounce back on your desk that show you conservation of momentum. You can use your pool table to test it. And you can test reaction times by having a friend drop a ruler and you trying to catch it in your fingers. Those experiments, and when you apply them to the Zapruder film, prove the official version is wrong. And this is why Galileo was so dangerous to the Catholic Church, because it has a simple experiment to prove them wrong. Take your
official version that the Earth is the center of the universe is wrong. And this is very powerful, and I hope everyone will go home and try to do some experiments, and therefore be empowered, and I hope empowered people will take action. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Okay, I'm going to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to take questions from the audience, and then you were fading in and out so much, we've been alternately putting the cell phone to the microphone, and then you'd come back in. So I'm just going to do it all through the cell phone now, so I'll ask you the question, and then you can answer. So did anyone have a question on it?
Yes, sir. Could you tell how many shots occurred and at what point of the Zapruder film were those shots being? I mean, Zapruder 313 is a headshot. What are the other shots at what number?
Could you identify or determine where other shots besides the headshot occurred in the Zapruder film sequence?
There's definitely, almost certainly a shot that hits him in the back. That's probably a very small caliber weapon, like a .22. There's another shot that hits him in the throat from the front, and there's another shot, probably at least one. Another shot hits the street, and then another shot hits Kennedy from the grassy knoll, which is the final shot. So the answer is the data is corrupted, so it's hard to make anything with confidence, but that would be my best guess of where the shots came from.
Okay, I'm not sure that everybody heard that, but because there's some background noise.
No, it did not.
But I would just take them off. Can we just get them on the microphone and, okay. Okay, so another question?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Could Could you repeat that first
Well,
answer?
we don't have another question, so repeat the answer. I'll see if we can get it this time.
Okay, the answer is there's probably a shot that hits him in the back and also hits him in the lung. That
What
didn't
number?
penetrate his body, so it's not a big rifle like a Carcano. It's a small caliber round like a 22, or it could be a fragment that just didn't have a lot of momentum to punch through. Another shot hits him in the throat from the front that could have also been shot from the grassy knoll, potentially or another location in Dealey Plaza. One shot, at least one shot hits Connolly, and then another shot hits a bystander, James Tague, in the street, and then another shot hits Kennelly from the front. So there are at least, I think, 4 or 5 shots, the number of shots, and that's consistent with what you see in the acoustic record.
Do you have any estimate of where in the Z film sequence, which frames these shots happen?
Probably a shot occurs at 2:10, another occurs at about 2:30, which is when Connolly thinks he's hit. Probably a shot that occurs earlier at 182, something along those. And then the headshot's about at 3:12, 3:13, and there may have been a shot occurring after that.
Getting the next speaker. Okay, I got another question. Just a second.
Does he think there might have been a shot that hit Kennedy in the back of the head just a microsecond before the major shot that hit him in the front of the head?
There's a chance that another shot hit Kennedy in the head a microsecond before, behind him, a microsecond before the one in the front.
There's a chance that happened. I can't rule that out. I think the reason his head does go forward from 312 to 313, I believe that's because the driver stopped the limo. And you can see on the Zapruder film, if you look down the National Archives at the full-speed version, he stops dead just before that shot hits him. So if the car decelerates rapidly, the head will move forward, especially if he's liftless at that point, which it looks like he was. So that's a good explanation for that. It's conceivable a shot in from the rear. I wouldn't want to hang my hat on that because I don't have a lot of confidence in the medical data. But it's possible that happened.
Hello, Bill.
Anybody else?
Joe Green, get over.
Okay, well listen, thanks for applying physics to the case, and I'll let the audience tell you what they thought. Thanks for being with us, Paul.
My pleasure.
All right.
Yeah. Yes, hi. Yes, it's me.